Hi, you're with India Post Live, India's first online news conversation web TV. I'm Ishan Russell, and India Post Live is, of course, a place where we love to hear your voice, your opinion. So get in touch with us. Use social media to do so. Use Twitter, hashtag India Post Live to your tweets, or use our Twitter handle at India Post Live. You can use Facebook. We have a Facebook page called India Post Live. Just go there, like it, comment on it, talk to us over there. Or you can go to IndiaPostLive.com. That's our website. You can watch this video live, or you can watch this later. In case you're watching it later, you can watch the other videos that we have over there for you as well. So, and a wall also for you to comment on. So you can, and in case you want to come into the discussion, have a comment or a query for our experts over here, well, very simply, you can just use Skype or Google Hangout to get in touch with us, and we'll of course take your views into this conversation. All right, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about Africa and the role India and China are vying for over there. Well, China has certainly taken the lead. India has relations in Africa, has had citizens traveling to Africa forever, for almost more than a century now. But China has really taken the lead over the past 15, 20 years in terms of investment. So now that India has a new government in place, how prominently will Africa figure on the new Indian government's agenda? We'll be discussing all that and more with Simran Sodhi. She's the Foreign Affairs Editor at The Statesman. We also have with us Atish Ayabi. He's a former journalist, and he's written a paper on India and China in Africa. We'll also be joined by voices from Africa and India talking about the challenges. But Simran, how big a priority is Africa for India now under a new government?
I think what we've heard so far, we really haven't heard anything about Africa. We heard about the neighborhood with the SAARC nations invited for the swearing in. We have the PM traveling, but he's traveling to Bhutan, then he travels to Japan, and then he travels to Brazil, and then he travels to the US. At least that's how much we know. So till now, we really haven't heard any trips planned for Africa or any high-level delegations or any talks happening with Africa. So my assumption is that Africa is going to be the second priority, which it kind of always has been. As India's economic thing is growing, we are tending to be more focused on nations like Japan or the US, where our economic trade is very big. And also it makes us look bigger on the world stage, which is unfortunate because Africa can give us a good, strong foothold in a big continent, in a big area. But unfortunately, the Africa thing has not been explored by India to an extent that China has, for example, done it. India has always traditionally relied more on the fact that we have had historical links with Africa. We've had people traveling to Africa, but failing to build that historical link in an economic way. Right. Economically, we've gotten left behind by China. And I think the policies are to be blamed. Where there were investment opportunities, the government, the private companies, they were late in sending tenders. When you're late, when you miss deadlines, then you don't get the projects. If you don't get the projects, you lose out economically. So unfortunately, till now, we have not heard the new government talk about Africa. I hope they talk about Africa in a month's time, in 2 months' time. But if we were to analyze the situation just now, looking at the new government, the assessment would be that Africa does not seem to be anywhere in the top priority. The top priority still seems to be our bilateral with the US, with Japan, and with the neighborhood.
All right, well, Atish, should Africa be a priority? Why should it be? I mean, you've written a paper on it, so why should India really be bothered about it?
It should definitely be a priority, but one thing is very clear, that it won't be overnight. The simple reason is that when we are comparing what China did in Africa, the biggest thing was the amount of money they were pumping in. It goes to trillions. And India is talking about still about 250 billion or so. So first, to get that amount of capital to back your projects and investments, that is going to take some time. So I think the priority could be perhaps, and I don't know, I'm not really aware of the South Bloc thinking, but we could be looking at first getting our economic growth and our coffers back to be able to back up any investments and projects in Africa. So I think it will take a bit of time. And if we can muster that kind of capital, I think we may still have a chance of going ahead and kind of bidding for the kind of things that China is doing right now.
All right, but Simran, India seems to be following this in terms of foreign policy. Like for example, in even Afghanistan, we're investing majorly in schools, hospitals, rather than bigger infrastructure projects, which of course American companies and other global companies are there involved in. And similarly, it seems the case in Africa, where China is investing heavily in the big infrastructure projects, but India is focusing on the education, schools. Is that because of monetary constraints, or is that a foreign policy decision that has been taken?
No, I think the constraint or the handicap is that Chinese companies are very good in building infrastructure. So when you travel, say, to a country like Nepal and you see a road that was built by India, for example, and then you travel a little more in Nepal and you see a road which was built in China. So the difference is visible to anybody. The Chinese do a good job in building infrastructure. So for African countries also, if they are going to spend money, if they are going to give money for a project, they also want value for that money. And unfortunately, what we have seen, Chinese companies are delivering, Indian companies are not really being able to deliver. In Afghanistan, we have a constraint because we have decided as a matter of foreign policy, we will not go into the projects which are beyond reconstruction. But in Africa, those restraints really don't exist, and India can explore greater options. We have more flexibility. The governments of Africa tend to be more or less more friendly towards India than China. So I think it's sad that India, despite having this, you can almost say a kind of a warm affection with almost all the African nations, you have not been able to convert this into an economic priority. Because economically, if India was to push as hard as China pushes, we could get more projects. But I think what is lacking is the initiative, one, to push for projects. Two, also in the work that is finally shown. You must show that your work is world class. The roads you build or the schools you build, they are really up to the world class standards.
All right, let's get in a voice from Africa. Professor Dilip Garaj joins us. He's an economist. He's joining us from Johannesburg. Thank you very much for coming in, Professor Garaj. How would you see the race between India and China for, some would call it the colonization of Africa, others would say for a greater partnership with Africa, but how would you see it?
Well, certainly I believe that the partnership between India and South Africa is a great one. And I really believe that, as the earlier speaker pointed out, there is this warm affection between these countries, the whole continent of Africa as well as India. But I really believe that that warm affection is not being converted into business. And perhaps India is very slow from a business perspective, because remember, as far as India is concerned, if the cultural ties are so strong between the countries, and also the fact that English is a spoken business language, certainly they should be ahead of China, because China, with the Chinese Mandarin language and so on, that creates major barriers and certainly is a problem. But I really believe that Chinese people are very enterprising. They are entrepreneurs. They actually see the opportunity. They see the gaps in Africa, and they're really exploiting these gaps. But also remember that as far as the Chinese government is concerned, their philosophy is a lot different. They, like India, have a problem with overpopulation of people, and what they do is that they like to send their people across the world. And this is what they're doing at this point in time. They move people away from China into other parts of the world, and they don't go empty-handed. In fact, they give them money, they give them goods, and actually tell them to go into other countries around the world, and in Africa in particular. And what we found most clearly is that they create these ties with the Chinese people of China. So what happens if somebody comes into Africa and comes into South Africa, for example, from China, he would then start up his own retail outlet in South Africa, perhaps in Johannesburg, but he will get all his goods from China. So he's promoting Chinese business in that way. Certainly, India is not doing that. And clearly, I think India needs, I think they need a wake-up call. Certainly, there's huge opportunities in Africa. We know that the African continent is the richest continent in mineral resources, and that is what the Chinese are plugging for. They clearly believe that there is a lot of money to be made in Africa itself, and they can draw on the resources, but India is nowhere to be seen.
All right, in terms of perception, how do governments or people view India or the Indian people? Not in the sense of conventional thinking, but in terms of economics, in terms of building infrastructure. What is the perception like over there?
Well, certainly the perception is that the Indian people are good at business, and certainly they do have skills. And in particular, the African continent requires these skills. So it's a question of bridging the gap between this perception that these skills are available, but how does one really bring those skills into the African continent? I think that that is an issue that needs to be addressed by both continents, if I may use that. India in particular, and as well as the whole African continent.
Go ahead.
No, I'd just like to point out the thing that he was talking about is Chinese coming into Africa. What we found out was that it's a sort of a double-edged sword, because if you look at in the past, in countries like Zambia and others, the Chinese, there have been attacks against the Chinese because if you just take an Ethiopian Airlines flight and go up to Addis Ababa, you'll see the one coming from Beijing. It's just hundreds and hundreds of Chinese workers. So imagine you're going into a country to develop their infrastructure. You're getting your own labor. You're not even using the local labor. And then they come in as migrants, set up their own businesses, and in a way also displacing the livelihood of the locals. And that has not been taken very positively. So I think that approach has been, will probably in the long term remain a fundamental difference between India and China. And somewhere, probably in the next 10 to 15 years, you may see the India actually holding a little more steadier than the Chinese as far as the perception is concerned and the way the Chinese are being treated there.
All right, an interesting point you make over there, but I want to come to the security angle, Simran. How important is the African continent? I mean, it's a huge continent, and I'm sure there would be many security features, but for India, is there a security angle also as far as Africa is concerned?
I think for not just for India, I think for the world generally, Africa is becoming somewhat of a security concern. You have North African countries especially, where we are seeing more and more the presence of the Al-Qaeda. We are seeing a spread of what we call the radical Islam. And we also, as we see reports coming in of the Taliban fighters in Afghanistan or Pakistan, a lot of these people are now not just coming from countries like Uzbekistan, they are also coming from North Africa. And one of the reasons people have rationalized is that there is a lack of employment in their own nations. The only education that is available to them is to go to madrasas in Pakistan, not even in Africa. So Africa, somewhere to the US, to India, I think to the entire world, because of the sheer poverty that you have. And also because of this Islamic revival which is happening in the very radical view, is causing a lot of concern as to how does then one deal with a continent like Africa, where you have Al-Qaeda, which is becoming very strong, and it's not going to be easy for the US or for India or for anybody in the world to deal with an Africa with a number of people who believe in this philosophy of Islam, which is so much extreme. It's going to become very difficult with time. We see it in our own neighborhood, how difficult it is becoming in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. And now you have these fighters, they are migrating from one nation to the other, and the only thing that is uniting them is terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Taliban, because Al-Qaeda is no longer something which is limited to the Afpak region. You have people coming very actively from North Africa, and somewhere I think India, the US has to sit down, they have to realize that they have to stop this trend. So security wise, yes, for India it should be a greater concern than what it is presently. We are very focused on Afghanistan, Pakistan, but we overlook the fact that a lot of Taliban, Al-Qaeda fighters in this region are coming from North Africa, and this number is not likely to go down till we actively find a policy, we find a way to stop this flow of people.
And complementary to that is also maritime security. If you look at the whole piracy issue and protecting the sea lines of communication, because you have, you have the oil and you have other natural resources coming into, towards the Indian Ocean. So, and given the heavy presence of the Indian Navy and other Navy, Africa is also becoming one of those platforms where various international navies have cooperated despite their own, kind of political differences. So security-wise, I think in the past also you've seen that India has kind of, at least from a naval point of view, it maintains a pretty steady presence.
Mm-hmm. Interesting points you make over there. But as far as Africa is concerned, the other thing that I want to talk about is what else can India do? I mean, from here on, in terms of engagement, Simran, is there enough engagement happening in terms of, I mean, we saw Narendra Modi coming in as Prime Minister and immediately SAARC sort of saw a revival. Do we have those mechanisms existing with African nations, and can we revive those? Will there be more impetus given on them, and should there be?
I think India needs to have one more people working on the Africa policy. I think we have a handicap that in the people or the people who work on policies in Africa, Africa doesn't have too many hands. Africa is a big continent and it has a lot of countries. So it's not like you have 2 people who are specifically working, say, on Nigeria, or 4 people specifically working on South Africa. That is unfortunately not happening because there's a handicap of good trained professionals. And somewhere I hope the new government brings in more trained professionals, more trained Africa experts. Like we have put in a lot of resources, a lot of people, specialists to study Afghanistan, to study just Pakistan. We need to do that with Africa. A greater engagement will happen when we have a better understanding of what is happening in Africa. A country like South Africa, we still understand more. There is still more engagement. You know, in the Indian president or vice president will occasionally travel there. Their people come here. But other countries, we seem to be totally out of the loop, especially given countries like Egypt and all. A greater engagement is needed, and it's needed quite urgently, I think.
Very interesting point to make over there. I want to just play out a graphic for our viewers also. This is about India, China and the United States, and all 3 of them, their trade with Africa, and India's trade is somewhere between around 60, I'm not too sure as far as the figure is concerned, 60 billion, sorry. So 60 billion, China's over 200 billion. The US investment has gone down. Does that surprise you, Simran?
Not really. I don't think Africa has remained that much of a priority for the US. The US has its hands full with the mess they created in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're trying to get out. Pakistan, they are unable to manage, and then their own economy is not doing so well. So I don't think the US is very interested in being this global police cop that it once was. They have their own problems, their own unemployment rate is going up. So I think they're trying to focus more on themselves and also on their relationship with Europe. You have Russia now, which is again becoming very aggressive. So I think for the US, Africa has lost that sense of priority which it had maybe 2 or 3 decades back.
All right, we have another guest joining us. Varun Mishra joins us. He runs a company that specializes in helping organizations set up trade in Africa. Thanks very much for coming in, Varun. If you could have Varun, please. Yeah, hi. Yeah, Varun. So I wanted to ask you, how easy is it for Indian companies to can you hear me? All right, we seem to have lost that. We'll go back to Varun a little later. Meanwhile, let's go across to Johannesburg to Professor Garage. Professor Garage, as far as the amount of money is concerned, how do the Indians in Africa see this? Do they want greater engagement? Are there communities over there that look to facilitate greater engagement with India?
Well, certainly in South Africa, I can speak of South Africa in particular, and I would think Kenya would be a similar sort of economy. There are lots of Indian nationals. Firstly, in South Africa, we have 3rd generation Indians who have lived here for a number of years. You know, Indians arrived in South Africa way back, it's about 160 years now. So certainly they want to see that engagement. There is no doubt the cultural ties are still there. South African Indians, from a cultural perspective, more or less look towards India as being their mother country. From a cultural perspective, and certainly they want to see the business ties foster and grow. So we in South Africa certainly believe that that needs to be done, and we look forward to it. As far as the rest of Africa is concerned, I really believe there are many Indian nationals in the rest of Africa who also want those kind of ties to be maintained. So from a business, and then to see it further in business. So certainly I believe that India needs to look closely at that aspect and see how they can grow business into Africa.
All right, but do global powers really see, I mean, from an African perspective, do global powers really see Africa as a big market? Because that is why India and China saw a lot of investments happening, because their markets, the domestic markets, were seen as huge markets. Is it the same perception as far as Africa is concerned over there?
Well, it is, because, I mean, if you really think about Africa, and it was earlier pointed out, it's broken up into many countries as a continent. They have about 53 countries in Africa. They have a population of 1 billion people. And you must remember that whilst the income levels are low in Africa in general, by and large, you'd find that it is a shining continent at this point. It is the richest continent from a resource point of view, mineral resources. So certainly you find that many of the developed countries are looking into Africa to do business. And I think India needs to do the same as well. So I certainly see that the Indian nationals see prospects in the African continent and they need to exploit it.
All right, Aatish, would you agree with that? As far as India is concerned, does India see Africa as big enough of a market?
I think it does see, but I think somewhere there lies the problem, because Africa has always been seen as this homogeneous entity where we never speak about, as Simran mentioned, you have a North Africa which has its own set of problems, and then you come down to the East, Central and West, which brings in a bit of dynamism to the way Africa presents. So I think first of all we need to kind of de-link and treat it as a continent with, as he said, 53 different countries. First of all, the other is also keep an eye, I think, and India has been doing that, on what others are doing wrong. To just give you an example, and we are just moving away from Africa. China, what it did in for example, Myanmar, and it sees the fallout, is that it did not take the local sentiments into account, and today you have, dam projects being shelved, and China is paying for it. So I think India needs to wait for probably the Chinese to make mistakes, and which a lot of analysts have pointed out that probably the time is going to come. That's one. And the other is the whole thing of treating every part of Africa as separate and engaging with them in a more, I think, giving it a little more importance than we are doing right now.
You pointed this out earlier as well, Simran, the fact that we do not have enough people, perhaps in the foreign ministry, working on Africa, thinking, think tanks, not really thinking about Africa. But where do we go from here? I mean, are there enough steps being taken by the government itself to facilitate business from a private angle to go into Africa?
I think what we saw in the last government, or the last one decade that we had UPA 1 and UPA 2, was there was a certain thrust to improve business. So we had this India-Africa conclave, which is still going on. But I still don't think it has fully tapped the potential that a continent like Africa can do. And there's a lot of expectation from the new Modi government. One expects them to be more proactive in the area of foreign policy. We haven't heard about Africa, but I hope that as they go about revamping the structure, Africa gets greater priority. They're able to assign more people and give it more attention than what we have had in the last decade or so.
All right, and as far as the kind of support India can get, because see, India is trying to vie for a larger piece in the global pie, as they may say. For example, UN Security Council, see, the African countries could play a very critical role over there.
In fact, we talk about cultural ties, but the strongest ties came about, starting with 1976, where it was the African countries that helped, China get that recognition. And China, even today, almost feels indebted to the African nations, and somewhere around, I think in 2000...
They don't feel indebted to India for getting them into the United States.
Exactly. So I think that is a very crucial point that we need to look at, at the international platform as well. And most importantly, Africa today is growing at 6%. I mean, even we are not. So I think that recognition needs to come in, that it is 6 of the African countries are, they're in the top 6, fastest growing countries today. So I think that recognition, along with a public-private partnership, you see Bharti Airtel being there. You have already the ONGC kind of going and putting a large footprint there. So I think the public-private partnership will end up probably being a more practical answer to our increased engagement in Africa.
All right, Professor Garaj, but as far as security is concerned, and security of businesses in Africa, if Indians want to come to Africa and do business, and I'm saying across the board, because there have been quite a few instances, and Simran has been written about them and has observed them also, of kidnappings, of things going slightly awry, and those kind of fears perhaps are not driving Indian businesses to go in flocks to Africa. Is that really a case? Would you concur with that?
I would concur with that. I certainly think North Africa is a serious problem as far as that is concerned. Kidnapping, perhaps these religious kind of wars that are taking place. The southern part of the African continent is not a problem, but certainly in a country like ours, crime is a problem. And we are concerned about crime in South Africa. And I think that does deter foreign Indian nationals from coming into a country like South Africa in particular, because our problem is that we certainly have a lot of crime, people get murdered, and so on. So that is of concern. But by and large, some of these concerns are being addressed, and I really think that like any other part of the world, there are these kinds of concerns. So they can be overcome, I'm sure, without too much of fuss.
All right, final word, Professor Karach, about what would be the one thing that you would want from the new government as far as engaging with not just South Africa, but the entire African continent is concerned?
I really believe that the new government needs to take a fresh view about the African continent and just, post the 2008 recession that we've experienced, there are huge opportunities in the African continent. The African continent has a lot to offer from a mineral resource point of view, and they need to exploit those opportunities. So clearly the government must take a fresh view and look at the continent in a bright light and then go forward.
All right, final words, Atish. As far as your word advice for the Indian government to on Africa.
I think, as I said, one is the public-private partnership, because private players are looking at Africa as a substantial market, and in any country, even in China, they are the ones kind of, driving the government to go ahead and negotiate with the leaders so that they can pave way for more investment. So I think public-private partnership is definitely the way to go, and I think strategic engagement at various levels, trying to give them enough due, like she said, it doesn't figure, Africa hasn't figured so far in any of the, talk that we have heard from the Prime Minister. So I think a little bit of noise needs to also be made so that the Africans don't think that they are just, we are coming in and taking stuff out.
All right, your take finally, Simran.
My take would be that historically we have a good connection with Africa. The point is, can we build on it? We always, whenever there's a talk on India-Africa, India especially goes on harping, we have historical links. My biggest question to the new government would be, yes, we have this historical link, we have this goodwill in Africa for India, but can we build on it? Can we build on it economically? Can we compete with the Chinese in a purely professional manner in infrastructure, in reconstruction in China? That would be my question, and I think that would be a challenge for the new government, that can they accomplish all this in a continent which is offering a lot of opportunities for Indian businessmen and for India as a whole.
And I think also determining how much money they can actually park. As I said, the Chinese they invest in trillions. You just saw 250 billion is what they are talking about, and we are somewhere around 60. So I think if we have that capital, we need to generate that so that we can focus on Africa and try and compete as far as at least investment money is concerned.
All right, interesting points made over there. Thank you very much for coming in, all of you, for sharing your perspective on this. Professor Karach, thank you very much for coming in all the way from Johannesburg. Simran and Atish, thank you very much for coming into our studios and shedding light on this. Well, that was a little presentation on India and China and the race for Africa. What do you think about it? Write into us, tweet out to us, use social media to get in touch with us, and we'll, of course, put your views on air. Thanks so much for joining in.